The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Contained herein are the heresies of Radolf Buntwine, erstwhile monk turned traveling medical investigator. Join me as I study the secrets of the divine plagues and uncover the blasphemous truth that ours is not a loving God, and we are not its favored children. The heresies of Radolf Buntwine, wherever podcasts are available.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this is a super special episode. Today, I am going to be sharing with you a chat that I had with author Flora Fraser. So she is a writer of historical biographies, which have included, she wrote The Washingtons, George and Martha. She also wrote Beloved Emma, The Life of Emma, Lady Hamilton, The Unruly Queen, The Life of Queen Caroline, which is about Caroline of Brunswick, who we've talked about on this podcast, as well as Princesses, the Six Daughters of George III. And her most recent book, which is just coming out in North America, or by the time you hear this, it is out, so you should buy it. It's called Flora Macdonald, Pretty Young Rebel, Her Life and Story by Flora Fraser. And so I just want to orient us all into where this story takes place in history in terms of this podcast and other people we've talked about. So you remember Charles II, who we talked about, he had that whole thing where he was on the run, he was hiding up a tree, things like that. So he took over as king. He was one of the Stuart kings, and then he didn't have any legitimate children. So his brother James took over as king, as James II. James decided to become Catholic, and a lot of people weren't into that. And so he was deposed, and the people who took over from James II was James's older daughter, Mary, and her husband, William. They ruled as William and Mary. And then after they died without any children, then James's other daughter, Anne, took over. And that's Queen Anne, who we've talked about on the podcast, Queen Anne from The Favourite. She did not have any surviving children. So then after her, it went over to the Hanovers. That's George I, who was a German man who spoke German, and he took over. So these were, if you're somebody in England who wants to have like a man as your king, like you're not excited about William and Mary. You're not excited about Anne. Then you're not excited about this German guy coming over. So after James II, Charles II's brother, who was deposed, he was not killed. He was just sent into exile with his younger second wife, Mary of Modena, who was the daughter of one of the Mazarinets. They had children. And so the children of James II, like he had a son and the son had a son. And so that lineage, those Stuarts, there were kind of fans of them who considered them to be actually the real king. And they wanted them to go back over to England and take over from Anne, to take over from George. And that's where the Jacobite thing whole comes from. That's people who supported them are called the Jacobites. We explain why they're called that in this podcast anyway. So that leads to a man called Charles Edward Stuart, aka Bonnie Prince Charlie. And that's a major factor in the story that we're going to talk about here today. I mean, the main thing we're talking about is Flora Macdonald. But we know about her because of what happened between her and Charles Edward Stuart, aka Bonnie Prince Charlie. But she did a whole lot more than that. I was so delighted to talk to Flora about, Flora Fraser is the author. She wrote the book about Flora Macdonald, and she was actually herself named after Flora Macdonald, but we talk about that as well in this episode. So I really hope that you're going to enjoy this chat between myself and author Flora Fraser. So welcome, Flora Fraser.
Thank you, Anne. Great to be with you.
I'm really delighted to be talking to you about this book and about the character of Flora Macdonald, the main heroine of the story. Could you start by situating us in a place and a time, just so we can understand the importance of her story, what was going on in the world around her?
Sure. So we're in the Highlands of Scotland, and in fact in the islands off the west coast. And a prince known today in the UK, where I live, as Bonnie Prince Charlie, but he's a Stuart prince who's come from Europe to try and take back the English crown for the Stuarts, because there are now, in 1745, which is the time, there's now George II, the grandfather of George III, the Hanoverian monarch we all know, who lost the Americas. And he's on the throne. And so Bonnie Prince Charlie comes, and no one thinks that his venture will succeed, but he rallies the Highland clans, names we all know today, Macdonalds, Campbells, MacLeods. Many of these, of course, today have since emigrated to Canada and the States. And they sweep down victorious against the Hanoverian army, or the Redcoats, until they get near London, only 100 miles from London. And the king, of course, George II, everyone's freaking out in London. But the king's son, the Duke of Cumberland, is the general in charge, who pushes Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, back up to the Highlands, and on a moor outside Inverness called Culloden Moor, the Redcoats, the Hanoverians, utterly defeat this Highland army, and Charles Edward, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, flees from the battlefield, which is on the east coast in the Highlands, to the west coast, and he's trying to get from there back to France and Italy. He grew up in Rome because the Stuarts were exiled in the previous century. And he is thinking that he's going to manage it, and he's on an island way out in the Atlantic, really, the Western Isles, or the Outer Hebrides. And then the Redcoats arrive on the island, and in desperation, he comes to the shepherd's hut at midnight, where this young gentlewoman, Flora Macdonald, is minding her brother's cattle, and he says, "Please help me." And a plot is concocted, and Bonnie Prince Charlie, who's 6 foot and incredibly well known, with this long oval face, is dressed up as Flora's Irish maid, Betty Burke. And Flora and Betty Burke, the prince in disguise, are rowed over the sea to Skye. And it's from that midnight voyage, following on their midnight meeting, that there comes that haunting song, Speed, bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, over the sea to Skye. Because from Skye, an island nearer the west coast, Bonnie Prince Charlie hopes to get to the mainland where a French ship can come in and get him away. And that does eventually happen. But meanwhile, he, as Betty Burke and Flora, spend a week in the most sort of desperate situation with redcoats on all around them. The prince eventually gets away, but Flora is imprisoned. She's taken on board a Royal Navy vessel, and she's taken a prisoner down to go on trial in London.
So she was just a gentlewoman minding her own business on this small island, and suddenly she's involved in this situation.
Yes, although she is minding her own business, everyone in the Highlands has been involved over this past year. Either they've gone with the Highland Army or down to try and take the throne from George II in London, or they've been commandeered as local militia by the government. And the truth is that everyone's talking with a forked tongue, which is very much the Highland way. And so Flora actually knows very well that he's on the island. She wasn't expecting him to come to her. And as she's very reluctant to get involved, because this is a young, handsome and gallant prince who's already had numerous love affairs during his year in Scotland. And she fears for the loss of her reputation, because in those days, if you were a gentlewoman, or even in the Western Isles, you needed to be pure or a virgin in order to get married. And she was of marriageable age now, in her early 20s. But with her, with the prince, goes at all points a cousin of hers. So there is, in effect, a chaperone. But it's an extraordinary story of Flora and a chief's wife secretly sewing this maid's costume for this enormous man. And then the prince makes a very, very bad woman because he's not used to having all these skirts. And his father had been called the old pretender, like a pretender to the throne. So the government, the Hanoverians, call Charles the young pretender. And someone says, well, he's picking up his skirts sort of up to his waist to get over a burn, as you know, they call the little streams. He says, if you're a pretender, you're the worst pretender I've ever seen.
This all, I'm not sure what the direct relationship is, but it does remind me of his distant ancestor, Charles II, who also went on the run in disguise and was a very tall man.
Absolutely, and hid in the tree, and yeah, absolutely. You know, there are definite parallels. And in fact, later, they never meet again after Flora has got Bonnie Prince Charlie safely to the inn at, or the pub at Portree on the Isle of Skye, where they part, and he takes a boat so as to get to the mainland, and then she's later discovered and taken south. But he never again leads an expedition like this to try and restore the Stuarts to the throne. But having dressed up as an Irish maid, it seems he gets quite keen on being in disguise. And for the rest of his life, And he actually is, he reaches nearly the age of 70. He is always dressing up as as a priest or sometimes as a woman. So it's obviously given him a taste for masquerade. For her, it was dead serious. And, although some thought, because the French hadn't supported Bonnie Prince Charlie's attempt on the throne, so many thought that it was doomed to failure, which indeed it was. But nevertheless, it was absolutely key to all the Highland chiefs and all those on their lands not to have Bonnie Prince Charlie taken when they were on their lands. This was the great dishonour that everyone feared, to have the prince taken. And that didn't occur, and he did get away. So there were kind of two halves to what is in Scotland called the 45, referring to this assault on the throne marching south to London, but also referring to the defeat of the Jacobite army, as it was called, the Stuart army, after Charles's father, James, would be Jacobus in Latin, and so it's the Jacobite that means the Stuart army. But the defeat at Culloden Moor took place, in fact, the next year in 46, and Flora helping Bonnie Prince Charlie to escape took place in the next year also, 1746, but it's referred to always as the 45.
I was wondering if you could speak about the legend of Flora Macdonald. You were named after her, right?
Yes, I grew up the other side of Inverness from Culloden Moor, which of course is still a very numinous place to visit, as are locations in the Highlands where battles or even the massacre of Glencoe is a numinous place to visit. So so I grew up and knowing her story, from as early as I can remember, and I also knew that Dr. Samuel Johnson, when who wrote the Great Dictionary, he came to visit Flora in Skye when she was now a matron of 50 and married with 7 children. And he and his great friend and biographer Boswell made this great journey from London. And Dr. Johnson was, old and gouty, but he longed to see Flora and hear this story from her own lips. And they stayed with Flora, and Johnson slept in the bed in which Bonnie Prince Charlie had slept. It was the only bed, in fact, in which he slept. He slept one night in a bed in all the time from April, when a Jacobite army was defeated, to the end of September, when he took ship for France. All the rest of the time he was hiding in, cowsheds or just lying on the moor in his cloak and kilt, the Highland dress, which was pretty good. The Highland dress in those days was a lot more voluminous, if you like, than it is. It wasn't just a kilt, if you know what I mean. It was a full plaid, which you could wrap yourself up in. And so, so I grew up with that, and I knew that Dr. Johnson and Boswell had made this journey, and they both wrote about it. But I never thought about something that Flora said to Dr. Johnson, and she was pleased as punch to know him too. It was 2 great characters of the 18th century meeting. And she said, "You were lucky to find me because I'm off to America." And at the time, growing up, reading Boswell and Johnson about the journey to the Western Isles, I didn't inquire any further. But it was after while I was writing my previous book about the marriage of George and Martha Washington, the Washingtons, I was looking for illustrations for the book. And as you can imagine, there are many revolutionary portraits to draw on. And I suddenly found among the portraits of Washington, Martha, Hamilton, all of them, there was a portrait of Flora Macdonald. And I thought, what is Flora Macdonald, who belongs to the 45 and Culloden and Skye and the boat song, what's she doing among these? And then I remembered that she had said to Dr. Johnson, I'm off to America. And just before the Revolutionary War, quite a lot of Scots from the west coast of Scotland, from the islands, emigrated, large numbers of them, to North Carolina. And she went too. And they went because the rents were being racked up and up and up by the chiefs who had, many of them, gone south, and the government had encouraged, or in some cases more or less blackmailed, the chiefs to make sure and have the heirs educated in the south. So where once these chiefs had been educated at Aberdeen University, Glasgow University, Edinburgh University, all ancient seats of learning, now they were being sort of pushed down to English schools, and then from there to English universities like Oxford or Cambridge. And then instead of marrying Scottish heiresses, if they could manage it, they were marrying English heiresses, if they could manage it. And so guess what? They stayed in London, and it was rather more expensive so they wrote to their factors or land agents and said, we need some more money. They didn't inquire where it came from, and the factors upped the rents. And so they were really being squeezed all over the Highlands. And in addition, just before the Revolutionary War, there were several outbreaks of cattle disease, really serious cattle disease, and that's what they sold at market on the mainland. That was like a crop, if you like. And in addition, there was something they referred to as the Black Spring, where everything froze and the cattle died. So, it conspired together to make for quite a wholesale emigration. Not for long, but it meant that when Flora and her family decided to up sticks, and they were all wanted to buy, however small, they didn't want to pay rent, with the uncertainty of the rent rises. So when Flora and her husband and family arrive in North Carolina, they quite logically go up the Cape Fear River to this town settled by Scots, which was then called Cross Creek, is now Fayetteville. And they inhabit this sort of Scots community where really everyone's doing very well. And there are several industries in North Carolina. There's a particular, the longleaf pine supplies pitch and tar for Royal Navy hulls and ropes. So, they're going into a colony where there's many going concerns. But unfortunately, Flora and her husband, Alan, buy in the spring of 1775. And we all know what happened then. And one of their sons, in fact, is a British officer. He's in the Marines at Lexington and Concord and later at Bunker Hill. So they're immediately in it. And they have to take sides. And whereas in the 45, the Hanoverians regarded Scots as rabble or vermin, these soldiers, by now the Scots had proved themselves notably in the French and Indian War, where they'd really sort of become some of the greatest fighters in the army. And so the Patriots in North Carolina wanted these Scots, but the Scots, who'd just come from Scotland and they wanted stability, couldn't believe that these ragamuffin patriots could possibly defeat the crown, who these Scots like Flora, they knew the power of the crown, had defeated the Highlanders in the 45. And moreover, they'd seen their own kith and kin go out and be officers and in the French and Indian War, officers in British regiments, and defeat the French and the Spanish. So they thought there was no question, but for stability, they joined up for the crown. And that all went horribly wrong. Really, really wrong. And the Patriots just took them all out in one fell swoop before they could even get weapons down on the coast from British ships who were bringing them.
And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. Look for The Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back.
And so then you've got Flora. The coincidence of going from one revolution to another.
I know, you couldn't make it up, and being on the wrong side both times. But it's so extraordinary because when she goes down to London and she is tried and effectively for high treason, for hiding the prince, for not, but she manages alone of the Jacobites to become a popular figure. As I said, most of them are vermin and rabble, whether they're a chief or whether they're a private, because she says, and she was very canny, which is, I mean, she was canny in that she knew what to say to whom. And she said to the officer who arrested her and brought her on his ship, he said, what made you do it? Because she had been through, I mean, although it was just a week, it was harum scarum, adventures, alarms. And she said, I would have done the same for you had you been in distress. And he writes that in a letter to a friend, a high society lady in London. And this remark of hers whips around London, and everyone, even before she's arrived, when the ship puts in at Edinburgh to the port there, Leith, people are coming on. She becomes a celebrity. And when she is released she's judged to have been guilty of treason, but is not punished for it because the government is London is choked with Highlanders who are sort of being tried, or they just say, this is enough. They've got to all go home. This is the year after. So this is 2 years after the prince came over. And so she's released. But, this quiet gentlewoman from the Western Isles, she has the leading portrait painters take her likeness because she has these rich patrons. They get together a fund for her to take home of £1,500. Well, minimum you used to, about 40 years ago, you used to multiply by 50, but it's now you multiply. But you get the feeling, you get the picture. She's going back, a celebrity. There are pamphlets and books and engravings everywhere. And throughout her time, living quietly when she marries, and they buy with, they don't buy, but they lease. They use some of her money to lease this house from the chief. She's using her connections in this very 18th century way of patronage. It's a system. It's what we would call today networking, but it was highly sophisticated. And I think because it was also patronage was how the clan system worked. So she was very, very good at it. And so for each of her 5 sons, she got a different patron to pay for them to go into the Marines. That was one. Pay for them to go out to the Bengal army in India. That was another. So, and she knew how to work her fame without ever compromising on the principles. And she was always a strong Presbyterian. So she was a woman of principle, but that didn't stop her doing the very best she could. And she needed to, because her husband...
I was just going to say.
Alan you just wanted to have a portrait of Alan hanging there because he was so handsome. And, Boswell says Mr. Macdonald was the very picture of a Highlander with his bonnet and the cock feather and his plaid, and he was. But unfortunately, money didn't stick to his hands, and he had schemes, and those schemes, and in the 18th century, it was an age where people were experimenting new forms of agriculture more, and Alan experimented, but you really couldn't experiment on the scale that he had to. You just actually had to rear the cattle and sell them. And so Flora did all the work, and it was she who wrote to the patrons, whereas normally it would have been for the father to write. And all the way through their time in North Carolina, and then Flora in New York, who knew, and Flora in Nova Scotia, because her husband, taken prisoner for 2 years, a prisoner of war in Pennsylvania, she worked with her son-in-law, who was a man of caliber, and so they worked to eventually get her husband to join his regiment in Nova Scotia, which, when he'd been exchanged, for a Continental or American officer, he was very reluctant to do and wanted to stay in New York, sort of fitting out a volunteer corps. And his commanding officer in Halifax, Nova Scotia, he said, "Will you get here? Because if you don't, I'm going to stop your back pay." But he was not. He was not. He meant no harm. That's the thing about Alan. But Flora had to constantly pick up the pieces.
And then she winds up back in Scotland.
Yes, that's right. And by now she's in her 50s, and she makes her way back to Skye, and by her son-in-law, who was, 20 years a Marine, a very capable officer, and also an illegitimate son of the MacLeod, one of the two local chiefs, two big chiefs, rather, on Skye. Her son-in-law and daughter are occupying Dunvegan Castle with their children. So, she actually is okay. And because the MacLeod, the chief, is away, so they're kind of housekeeping. So this, it's one of the most romantic castles in the world, although possibly not the warmest. But anyway, she's there. But then Alan comes back, and during the war, in the course of the war, 2 of her sons have died, not in battle, but in, part of troop movements, if you like. But she has great faith in her youngest son, who she left behind at the high school in Edinburgh and to be apprenticed to the law. In fact, he chose to go out to Bengal to be in the artillery. But he was like Flora. He was not only a doer, but extremely capable, intelligent. And he sent her back a pension of £100 a year. And I note that he did not send it to his father, he sent it to his mother. And on top of that, just a couple of years before, in fact, she would die in 1790 at the age of 68, her case came to the attention of the Prince of Wales, who would later go on to be the Prince Regent, and George IV, and was actually the first of the Hanoverians to be really interested in the Stuarts and Scotland. One thinks today, of course, there's Balmoral, but that was much later. Queen Victoria was, made Balmoral an amazing place and focus for the royal family in Scotland. But he was had many faults, but he was the first one to see that you could embed the Hanoverian dynasty better in the United Kingdom if you kind of grab the Stuart history too. So he sends her a pension of £50 a year. And it's rather marvellous to think that the great-grandson, as he was, of George II, who, in effect, Flora had been in opposition to, he's now taking care of her in her old age.
That's another twist. You just can't believe it. It just seems so improbable. Yeah.
I know. No, I mean, it's very improbable, but it really is all true. And it's backed up by papers in the Royal Archives, in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, in the colonial and state records of North Carolina. And, it's all documented. This is archival research. It's not myth. There is myth. There's lots of myth about Flora. Like she was imprisoned in the Tower. No, she wasn't. You had to be a peer of the realm to be imprisoned in the Tower, on the whole. And that she and Bonnie Prince Charlie were lovers. No, I mean, she had who wouldn't have a soft spot for this incredibly handsome and at that time very brave prince, and cheerful despite the failure of his plan. If he showed the best of himself during the time he was in the United Kingdom, this strange sort of year and a bit, I think managing by sheer charisma to get the clans to join up when the French weren't there and everyone was saying, oh, no, no, and the charisma and then this period when Flora observes him, bears any adversity with absolute, sang-froid or doesn't pay discomfort, anything like that, any attention, and does seem really to regret what he has brought upon the Highlanders, which is, in many cases, death, destitution, or eviction from their homes. Later, going back to Europe and the increasingly dissolute life he led there, you could say it was all disappointment. He was disappointing and he was disappointed. But when he rose to the occasion when he raised the clans, as it was called, and he rose to the occasion and was immensely solicitous all the week they were together of Flora's comfort and treated her like, she was his queen without them being a romantic couple.
So I just wanted to ask, so this book that's just coming out in North America, that's why we're chatting today. This is the first full biography of her in quite some time.
Yeah, there's not been one for some years. Although, all the ones that have been published are all interesting. It's, and there's even one which was a wonderfully sort of inventive autobiography of Flora, which was written by her granddaughter who had never met her. It's a wonderful story.
So what you have in terms of writing this new book is the American documents. Like, I think you were looking at sides of her life that maybe hadn't been explored in this way.
Yes, and I think that, certainly other biographers and historians have looked at these papers. The main, there are some Boswell papers in America at Yale in the Beinecke Library, which are fascinating. And although they're not physically in America, the colonial and state papers of North Carolina are part of a marvelous archival project called Documenting the American South. And so they're actually physically these papers in the British National Archives in London. It's one of those fantastic American projects, like when I was writing about the Washingtons, the University of Virginia has the Washington papers online. And so they were being written, these papers and letters, from North Carolina and about Flora or about her husband to England, but they are actually here. And then there are other papers here which tell in detail about the lives of these Scots emigrants in North Carolina, because when they come back, when effectively these loyalists are kicked out or, can't remain or don't remain, they submit memorials to government with claims for what they lost in America. So you get a whole community, and all of them saying that, indeed, Alan, Flora's husband, puts in his, Flora's son-in-law puts in his, but all their friends, and they're all sort of vouching in London for, I saw, Alexander MacLeod's 16 head of cattle, and they were fine and they were strong. I was at Neil MacArthur's home and he had, 12 barrels of beer. I mean, it's kind of because they'd made this life. I mean, totally Scottish. So fascinating. And obviously some remain.
No, and I was just going to say that time period, the timing is excellent for this book because the TV show Outlander.
Oh, I know. And I forget the series, but they go to Flora Macdonald's barbecue in North Carolina in the series, and the books are great too. But it's completely fascinating that now we're all watching this extraordinary emigration along with the time travel, and with Jamie and Claire and. It's really, having imagined it all these years, and while I was writing the book, it's the most wonderful thing to actually watch, and the brilliant imagination and accuracy too of the author, but then the performances and I write books, I don't make. So I'm not a discerning critic of what Diana Gabaldon just brings it all to life. It's so that period she has it's rather like while I was writing The Washingtons and Hamilton appeared, and of course in America people did always know this extraordinary story of the Revolutionary War, but the Civil War is nearer, and Hamilton just made the Revolutionary War sing in everyone's imaginations. And I think that Diana Gabaldon and all the actors and actresses have again made a different part of the Revolutionary War and also the 45 sing in our imaginations. And I'd like to think that Flora, Pretty Young Rebel, my Life of Flora Macdonald, will contribute to that song.
Well, and just bring it back to something you mentioned at the very beginning. Speaking of the song, so the Sky Boat song.
Oh my golly, yeah. I mean, we all sang it in school. It was like we all knew how to play it on the piano. And I mean, it was just like one of those. And then that's so fascinating that it wasn't written at the time. It was actually a lady, English ladies, crossing a loch, and the oarsman, so a loch in Scotland, and the oarsman is singing a Gaelic air, and she, being a musician, takes down the air and then brings it to this composer and Sir Harold Bolton, and he, by this time we're in the sort of late 19th century, puts these lyrics to it, and of course there were these. Scotland's got the fabulous songs and Gaelic airs and the dancing, but it's rather, it's being added to, if you know what I mean. It's still being added to, that the events of the 45 or earlier sort of key events that resonate down the centuries in Scotland, there are bards, there are dancers, there are still new Scottish dances being invented. It's living history. And I think Outlander it's been a fantastic incarnation of living history.
And I think what's really interesting and so important about the book that you wrote is you described Flora was immediately sort of a famous person, a legend, and people remember her for this boat ride. But you've written a whole book, and the boat ride is the first. It's not even the first third, because she did so much stuff afterwards. So we're seeing what's the truth behind.
Exactly, the truth behind and the woman behind the song.
Well, thank you so much for this chat.
Well, Anne, it was great. Thank you.
So again, that book is called Flora Macdonald, Pretty Young Rebel, Her Life and Story by Flora Fraser. It's available wherever you buy books, including if you use the link in the show notes to buy it through my bookshop.org link, then a little bit of money goes to support Vulgar History. But you can buy it wherever you buy books. It's so good. It's so interesting. It's so readable. Flora Macdonald is such an interesting character, and Flora Fraser tells her story incredibly well. You can keep up with this podcast. We're on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod and also on TikTok at Vulgar History. I'm always keen to hear suggestions for people you want me to talk about on the podcast, or honestly, books you think I should read or authors you want me to talk to. You can reach out to me. There's a form at the website vulgarhistory.com, or you can email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. You can also support this podcast on Patreon, where if you pledge at least $1 a month, then you get early ad-free access to all episodes. And for $5 per month or more pledge, you get access to bonus episodes, which are about every month. We put out a new episode of Vulgar Piece Theater. That's where I talk about costume dramas with Alison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. And also once a month-ish, there's episodes of So This Asshole, where I talk about awful men from history. That's all on Patreon. And you can join there at patreon.com/AnneFosterWriter. Of course, there is Vulgar History merch available at vulgarhistory.store, or you can always use code TITSOUT for free US shipping, or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. I'll be back again next week with another author interview, super special. And so until then, keep your pants on and your tits out.
Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Welcome to the small town of Chinook, where faith runs deep and secrets run deeper. In this new thriller, religion and crime collide when a gruesome murder rocks the isolated Montana community. Everyone is quick to point their fingers at a drug-addicted teenager, but local deputy Ruth Vogel isn't convinced. She suspects connections to a powerful religious group. Enter federal agent V.B. Laureau, who has been investigating a local church for possible criminal activity. The pair form an unlikely partnership to catch the killer, unearthing secrets that leave Ruth torn between her duty to the law, her religious convictions, and her very own family. But something more sinister than murder is afoot, and someone is watching Ruth. Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.